The Callahan property sat where the fog never seemed to lift, thick, pale, and slow-moving, like breath from something sleeping beneath the soil. By the time anyone remembered the family's name, the farmhouse had already sunk halfway into the earth, its roof eaten through by decades of rain and rot. Locals said the land was cursed long before 1853, long before the Callahans arrived with their 12 children and their strange, quiet ways. They said the air around that hill could make a man lose his sense of direction, that compasses spun wild the closer you came to the tree line, and that on certain nights, if you listened hard enough, you could hear crying, soft, distant, and too many voices to count. The Callahan property stood like a scar on the landscape, a place the sun seemed to pass over without touching, where the fog gathered thick and heavy as if the air itself refused to let go of whatever secrets the land kept buried. It was said that the mist there was unlike any other, a slow, creeping kind of fog that didn't roll in from the river or drift down from the hills but rose instead from the soil itself, as though the earth exhaled it each night. To those who lived nearby, it was more than weather, it was a warning, a breath from something old and buried that never slept. The ground was soft there, damp even in summer, and it had a way of swallowing things over time: boots, tools, fence posts, and eventually, the Callahan farmhouse itself. The earth didn't take it all at once. It claimed it piece by piece, year after year, until the roof sagged under the weight of moisture and moss, until the windows sank below the weeds, until only the top of the chimney could be seen through the fog. By the time anyone thought to remember the name Callahan, the house was little more than a ruin half devoured by the land that had never wanted it in the first place. No one could say exactly when the family had come to the valley. Records from that time were few, and the ones that did exist were as faded as the ink on old gravestones. What the townspeople remembered, or thought they remembered, was that the Callahans were different from the start. They kept to themselves, rarely came into town, and when they did, they spoke little and looked at people with eyes that seemed to see through them. They had 12 children, though some swore they'd seen more than that wandering the fields at dusk, pale shapes that vanished when called to. Their land stretched farther than any other farm in the region, but it yielded poorly no matter how hard they worked. Crops withered before harvest, animals wandered off and were never found again, and yet the family endured. They built their lives around that sinking house, as if bound to it by something stronger than choice. The townsfolk whispered about why they stayed. Some said they were too poor to leave, others that they were hiding from something, but the oldest residents claimed the land itself wouldn't let them go. There were stories of travelers who tried to cross that property and found themselves walking in circles, unable to find the edge of the woods again. Hunters spoke of compasses that spun wildly, of dogs that refused to follow scent trails once they crossed the fence line. There was something in the air there, a kind of pressure that made a man's head swim and his stomach turn, like the moment before a storm breaks, but the sky above the Callahan land was always still. Even the birds avoided flying over it. The fog clung to the trees and never lifted, and on certain nights when the moon was low and the mist thickest, people said they could hear the crying. It wasn't the sound of one person or even a few, it was dozens, maybe hundreds, soft and distant, like voices carried through water. No one knew where it came from. Some said it was the wind moving through the hollow, though the trees there didn't sway when it blew. Others believed it was the souls of those who had lived and died on that cursed ground, calling out from beneath the soil that had swallowed them whole. Every child in the nearby village grew up hearing those stories, passed down like warnings from one generation to the next. Don't go near the Callahan Hill after dark. Don't follow the fog. Don't listen when you hear the crying, because if you stop to listen too long, it starts to sound like your own name being whispered back to you. The legend of the Callahan property grew over time, but the fear remained the same. Even in daylight, the place seemed to resist being seen clearly. Travelers said the horizon bent strangely around it, that shadows there fell in the wrong direction. People who came close enough to see the remnants of the farmhouse described how the wood looked almost melted, warped and twisted as though it had been softened by heat, though no fire had ever been reported. The doors and windows were all gone, devoured by rot and dampness, but the structure still stood stubbornly, leaning into the earth as though being pulled under. Moss covered the walls like a shroud, and wild vines crept through the cracks as if trying to seal the place away forever. There was no birdsong, no insect hum, only silence so deep it pressed against the ears, the kind of silence that feels alive. For those who dared to step closer, strange things happened. Footprints in the mud would vanish behind them as soon as they were made. The air would grow colder, not in the way of a breeze but as if the warmth was being drawn out of their bodies. Some claimed that time itself felt wrong there, that their watches stopped ticking or that they'd lose track of how long they'd been standing. More than one person who entered the property came back changed, pale and trembling, swearing they'd heard voices calling from beneath the ground. They all said the same thing, that the land was breathing. It moved subtly underfoot, like something shifting in its sleep just below the surface. The Callahan family had lived and died there, their graves unmarked and their names nearly forgotten. Yet the house still bore their presence, or something that had taken their place. Whether it was the curse people spoke of or simply the earth reclaiming what was always its own, no one could say. But the fog remained, thick, pale, and unrelenting, rolling across the property each morning as though to hide what lay beneath. The town grew, the years passed, and the world changed around it, but that patch of land stayed the same, untouched by time or light. People learned to avoid the hill entirely, to drive faster when passing by, to pretend the crying was only the wind. But in the deep hours of the night, when the fog was at its heaviest, it was said that the earth still exhaled its breath across the valley, carrying with it the faint echo of the name Callahan, spoken softly, as though it were being remembered by something that had never truly forgotten. When the Callahans first came to that forgotten corner of the valley, they brought with them a sense of quiet that unsettled even those who tried not to notice such things. They arrived in the summer of 1853, their wagons creaking through the mist that already clung to the hills like a living thing. The family was large, 12 children, 2 parents, and an old woman whose eyes seemed too sharp for her frail body. They didn't come through the main road like most settlers did but instead followed the river upstream until it split and vanished into the woods. It was said they chose their land not for its fertility or view but for something else entirely, something they'd been searching for long before they reached that valley. Some swore they'd seen the father, Thomas Callahan, holding a yellowed map covered in symbols no one could read, tracing his fingers over it as though following instructions older than the land itself. When he stopped walking, he drove his stake into the ground and declared it home. From the beginning, there was a strangeness to how they built their lives there. They cleared no more than they needed to, leaving most of the forest untouched, as though afraid to disturb what lay beyond. Their house was raised quickly, too quickly, its foundation set deep into the wet soil rather than on stone. Neighbors who came to help said they heard the ground make a sound when the first posts went in, a hollow groan, as though the earth itself had sighed. The Callahans didn't speak much during the construction, and when they did, it was in a dialect that no one recognized, an old rhythm of words that sounded almost like prayer. Once the house was finished, they closed the shutters, lit no lanterns at night, and didn't come to town again for months. When they finally did, they brought with them strange goods to trade, jars of thick black honey, bundles of herbs that no one had seen growing nearby, and candles that burned with a pale blue flame. The townsfolk tried not to ask too many questions, but curiosity has a way of spreading, especially in small places. It was the children who noticed things first. When they passed the Callahan property on their way to the river, they saw lights in the woods, not firelight, not lanterns, but something softer, like the glow of phosphorus moving between the trees. At night, the sounds came, low humming that carried through the fog, rhythmic and almost human, rising and falling until dawn. People began saying the Callahans practiced rituals out there, that the old woman who lived with them, Thomas's mother, they thought, was some kind of witch. There were nights when travelers swore they saw her standing by the tree line, holding something that flickered like a coal in her palm, her eyes reflecting the glow. When approached, she would vanish into the mist, leaving behind only the faint smell of burning herbs. As the years passed, the family seemed untouched by hardship. While nearby farms battled disease, drought, and loss, the Callahans remained healthy, their livestock untouched, their children growing tall and strong. People started saying they'd made some sort of pact, though with what, no one dared guess. Yet for all their fortune, there was something hollow in their manner. The children were pale and quiet, their eyes dark and watchful. They spoke rarely and always together, their movements too synchronized to be natural. When they came into town, they stood in silence behind their father, their faces blank as though carved from wax. The townsfolk tried to be kind, but unease followed them like a shadow. There were stories of their youngest son wandering into the woods one winter night and never coming back, though no one ever saw the family grieve. They simply carried on as if nothing had changed, as if they had expected it. Then came the spring when the river turned black. For 3 days, the water that flowed past the valley was thick and dark, smelling faintly of iron and decay. Fish floated to the surface, their eyes milky and their bodies swollen. The town believed the Callahans had something to do with it, though no one could prove it. That same week, the fog around their property grew denser, spreading farther each night until it touched the edge of the main road. It clung to fences and doorways, and those who inhaled it swore it left a taste of copper on the tongue. A group of men went up to the hill one evening, carrying torches, determined to confront the family. Only 2 returned, both shaken and silent, unable to speak of what they'd seen. One of them died a week later, his body found in the river with mud packed beneath his fingernails, as though he'd been clawing his way out of the earth. After that, no one went near the Callahan place again. The fog became their border, and the town learned to treat it like a wall. The family was seldom seen after that, though faint lights still glimmered at night through the mist, and sometimes, if the wind was right, the same low humming drifted down the hill. Decades passed. People aged, moved away, and new generations came who didn't remember the Callahans except as a story whispered to keep children from wandering too far. By the time anyone thought to visit again, the farmhouse had already begun to sink into the ground, its roof caving and walls leaning inward as if drawn by the pull of something deep below. Inside, they found nothing, no furniture, no bodies, no trace of the family that had once lived there. Only the smell of damp soil and the faint imprint of footsteps leading down into the basement, where the earth had cracked open into a dark, hollow pit. It was then the old tales resurfaced, stronger than before. People said the Callahans had never left at all, that they'd simply gone deeper, beneath the house, into whatever lay sleeping under that cursed hill. The fog, they said, was their breath now, rising from the cracks in the ground to remind the living of what was buried there. Even after the land was abandoned, the strange lights continued, and those who dared to get close swore they could hear the faint echo of a voice, speaking in that same foreign tongue, somewhere deep within the mist. By the time the townspeople began whispering about the Callahans in earnest, the family had already withdrawn almost completely from the world. The path leading to their property grew over with weeds, and the wooden gate at the bottom of the hill hung crooked on one hinge, swaying softly even when there was no wind. What had once been a farmhouse surrounded by open fields was now nearly hidden beneath a curtain of trees and fog. The air there always felt thick, heavy with moisture and the faint scent of decay. Visitors who made the mistake of stepping too close spoke of a strange hum beneath their feet, a vibration too faint to hear yet impossible not to feel, as though the ground itself were alive. And it was this sense of quiet, watchful life that gave rise to the belief that something in that place resisted being forgotten. The Callahan land did not belong to them, it had never belonged to anyone. Those who dared to trespass said the forest around the farmhouse grew differently than any other patch of woods in the region. The trees were taller, their trunks gnarled and bent, their roots sprawling outward in strange directions, as if reaching for something unseen. Moss crept up every surface, and even the stones seemed to sweat under the constant mist. It was as though time itself moved slower there, leaves fell but never fully rotted, and footprints left in the mud remained long after the rain should have washed them away. People began to say that the land held on to things, memories, voices, perhaps even the dead. Hunters who wandered too far into those woods claimed to have found small wooden carvings nailed to the trees, shaped like human figures with hollow eyes. They swore they hadn't been there before, and yet when they turned away and looked back, there were more. It was the sound that frightened them most, the crying that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was never loud, never sharp, but soft and steady, like the sound of someone mourning behind a wall. Some described it as a chorus of women and children, others as whispers rising and falling in the fog. It always began at dusk, when the light drained from the sky and the first stars tried to pierce through the grey. Travelers passing the hill on those nights said it was impossible to tell whether the sound was in the air or in their own minds. More than one person stopped on the road, convinced the voices were calling to them, saying their name in tones that carried a terrible familiarity. When they fled, the sound followed for a time, echoing faintly across the valley until it faded back into the mist. No one knew where the crying came from, though theories spread like roots through the town. Some said it was the ghosts of the Callahan children, all 12 of them, trapped on their cursed land. Others said the voices were older, belonging to those who had lived and died there long before the family arrived. The oldest folk insisted that the hill had once been a burial ground, a place where the settlers disturbed graves that should have been left untouched. According to them, the Callahans hadn't built their home by chance, they had built it directly above something buried, something that breathed and remembered. The fog was its warning, its defense, its boundary between the living and whatever else lingered beneath the earth. Strange events seemed to confirm these suspicions. In the late autumn of 1862, when the fog grew thicker than ever before, a small search party was sent to look for a missing child, a young boy who had wandered away from his home at the edge of town. The men who went up the hill returned at dawn, pale and trembling, unable to speak of what they'd found. The only words one of them managed before he collapsed from exhaustion were that they had heard the child's voice calling for help, but it came from below the ground. The search was abandoned, and the town fell into uneasy silence for weeks. That winter, the river froze earlier than it ever had before, and the fog from the hill spread farther than anyone could remember, seeping through cracks in barn doors and clinging to the edges of fields. People began hanging iron above their doorways and burning sage on their window sills, old superstitions revived by fear. The stories might have faded if not for the night the ground itself shook. It was a mild tremor, barely enough to rattle dishes, but it came with a sound that none could forget, a deep, drawn-out moan that seemed to rise from beneath the valley. Those who were awake said it carried through the fog like a sigh from something vast and ancient. The next morning, the few who still dared to look toward the Callahan Hill swore they saw the chimney leaning farther into the earth and that a faint red glow pulsed from the soil near the foundation, fading as the sun rose. After that, even the bravest refused to go near. The path was swallowed by overgrowth, and the house itself sank deeper each year until only the top of the roof could be seen through the weeds. By the turn of the century, the Callahan name had become nothing more than a ghost story told by parents to their children, a way to keep them from wandering after dark. Yet those who had grown up near the hill never laughed when the subject came up. They knew the air there still felt wrong, still too heavy to breathe, still humming with the faint echo of that impossible crying. On certain nights, when the fog rolled down into town, people claimed they could hear it again, the distant sound of voices carried on the wind, overlapping and endless, as though all the sorrow the land had ever absorbed was trying to speak at once. Some nights, the mist would slip through cracks in windows and curl around sleeping faces, cold and damp, and in dreams, people would see the farmhouse standing tall again, whole and bright, the Callahan family at the door waiting with pale, expectant smiles. It was said that those who dreamt of that house always woke with mud on their hands or the faint scent of wet earth on their clothes. No one could explain it, but everyone understood what it meant. The land was still reaching out, still calling. The fog was no longer just a warning but an invitation, a whisper to come closer, to listen, to remember. And beneath it all, the crying never truly stopped. It only waited, soft and patient, until someone new stepped close enough to hear it again. The years wore on, and the Callahan land became a place spoken of only in hushed tones, a shadow in the minds of those who lived near it. The farmhouse, once proud and alive with the bustle of 12 children, now leaned like a dying tree against the pull of the soil, its walls dark with moisture and the slow decay of time. The roof sagged inward, and moss grew thick between the shingles, swallowing the wood whole. Windows that once caught the light now stared empty and black into the fog that never lifted. Yet even in its ruin, the house seemed to breathe. The mist gathered around it in unnatural shapes, curling upward like smoke, and the air inside the walls carried a faint, rhythmic sound, something that could have been mistaken for wind, but too steady, too alive. Locals began to say the Callahans had not truly left their home. That their bodies might have returned to the earth, but their presence lingered, feeding the land that had claimed them. Those who ventured close enough to the property told stories that didn't fit together but all carried the same feeling of unease. Some said they heard footsteps behind them when the fog was thick, slow, and deliberate, as though something heavy moved just out of sight. Others described seeing lights in the upper windows, soft, flickering glows like lanterns carried by unseen hands. A few swore that if you stood quietly near the edge of the tree line, you could hear voices murmuring from beneath the ground, low and indistinct, rising and falling like a heartbeat. The stories spread, and soon no one went near the Callahan Hill after dark. Even by day, the mist seemed to swallow sound. Horses balked at the foot of the path, dogs howled and refused to approach, and children were warned not to even look too long in its direction. The land had become something alive, and the house was its mouth, half open, waiting. Yet despite all the fear surrounding it, the property had a pull that no one could fully explain. Strangers sometimes appeared in town, drawn by the tales they'd heard from faraway places, men with notebooks, spiritualists, curious wanderers seeking proof of something beyond the ordinary. They would ask questions, take notes, and promise to return with evidence. None ever did. One such visitor, a professor from Boston, came during the autumn of 1901. He carried strange instruments and spent a week camped near the edge of the property, measuring the air, recording sounds, and sketching what he saw. On the final night of his stay, townspeople watched from afar as the fog grew so thick it hid his camp completely. In the morning, only his instruments remained, half buried in mud, their glass faces cracked as though pressed from beneath. His name was never spoken again. After that, the townspeople stopped trying to make sense of what happened on the hill. The stories hardened into warnings passed between generations. They said that the fog there wasn't weather but memory, that it was the breath of the land remembering what had been buried in it. The Callahans' fate was never confirmed, but people began to believe the family had become part of that breath, their voices woven into the fabric of the soil. On the coldest nights, when the mist crept into the lower fields, some swore they could hear laughter mixed with the crying, faint and distant, like echoes of a family still living the same night over and over again, unable to leave. A farmer who once tried to cut through the edge of the property for timber told a story that spread quickly through the town. He said that when his axe struck the first tree, the blade went dull instantly, and the trunk bled thick, dark sap that smelled like rusted iron. He dropped his tools and ran, but when he returned days later to retrieve them, they were gone, swallowed by the soil. Another man, a mason, claimed he found fragments of bone mixed into the stones he was gathering near the riverbank below the hill, each piece smooth and pale, as though polished by time. He buried them again, but afterward, he said his dreams were filled with the image of a house sinking into the earth, its windows glowing like eyes beneath the fog. Even the weather seemed to obey the curse. Storms would form over the valley without warning, sudden and violent, but they never touched the Callahan property directly. The lightning would flash around it, illuminating the farmhouse in stark bursts, and for those brief moments, the silhouette of the house looked whole again, restored, its roof unbroken, the door standing open as though waiting for someone to step through. When the storm passed, it would crumble back into its ruined shape, the illusion gone, leaving only the sound of dripping rain and the weight of the mist pressing against the ground. Some believed the curse was not a punishment but a hunger. The land seemed to crave attention, to draw eyes toward it even from miles away. Travelers often reported feeling watched when passing by, an invisible presence following them until they were safely beyond the fog. The older resident said the property fed on memory, that speaking the Callahan name too often was enough to stir the mist, to make it shift and creep toward the edge of town. No one dared to test it. Over time, the family's name was erased from records, and the hill was left unmarked on maps. But even forgotten things have a way of enduring. When the wind was still and the moon hung low, the outline of the farmhouse could still be seen through the fog, a ghost of its former self, shimmering faintly as if caught between this world and the next. Eventually, nature reclaimed what was left. Trees grew through the walls, ivy wound around the chimney, and wildflowers sprouted where the children's footprints once pressed into the mud. But the ground beneath remained soft, shifting, as though the land had never stopped breathing. On certain nights, those who lived nearest swore they saw shadows moving within the mist, shapes that walked like people but dissolved when approached. Some said it was the Callahan family, still tending to their home, still bound to the place that had swallowed them whole. Others whispered that the land itself had learned to take their shape, to lure the living closer. Whatever truth lay buried there, the hill remained untouched, its silence louder than any scream, its fog endless, patient and alive. As the decades passed, the Callahan Hill became a place the living simply learned to avoid, a forgotten wound in the landscape that never healed. Time did what it always does, it blurred names, eroded memories, and swallowed truths, but even as the town grew and modernized, that patch of land remained untouched. Roads were paved around it, power lines stopped short of its borders, and new maps of the area left it blank, as though nothing had ever been there. Yet despite its absence from the physical world, the place refused to disappear. On quiet nights, when the fog rolled down from the hills, people swore the air carried a faint hum, low and constant, like something beneath the earth still breathing. It was a sound that seemed to live just below hearing, felt more in the chest than the ears. Some said it was the sound of water moving through underground stone, others that it was the echo of the Callahans themselves, 12 children and their parents, their laughter and whispers trapped forever in the soil. Whatever it was, no one could deny that the land remembered. The few who had the misfortune of crossing that boundary in later years always returned changed. In 1924, a surveyor was sent by the county to assess the land for development. He was a practical man, not one for ghost stories, and he laughed at the locals who warned him to stay away. For 3 days, he camped near the edge of the hill, his tent pitched where the grass grew sparse and the air smelled faintly of metal. On the second night, he wrote in his journal that his compass had stopped working, that no matter how many times he reset it, the needle spun aimlessly, circling again and again. He also mentioned hearing what he described as the sound of crying far away, like children lost in fog. His last entry was dated the following morning and consisted of a single line, "The ground is moving." When a search party went looking for him, All they found was his journal half buried in mud and the shattered glass of his compass. The rest of his belongings were gone, and the grass where his tent had stood was flattened in a perfect circle, as if pressed down by something heavy that had since vanished. After that, no one else from the county ever returned to measure or mark the property. The land was quietly labeled unstables and left alone. But the stories continued. Some said that on certain nights, when the fog was thickest, you could see faint figures standing on the hill, pale shapes flickering in and out of the mist like candle flames. Others swore they'd seen the outline of the farmhouse appear briefly through the fog, whole again, before dissolving back into nothing. A few of the older residents believed the house had never truly vanished at all, it simply shifted, existing just beyond the veil of the living, appearing only when the air was heavy enough to hold it. The fog was its bridge, the thing that allowed whatever lingered there to reach out, even for a moment. In 1952, a group of local teenagers decided to test the legend. They were reckless, full of bravado, and eager to prove the old stories wrong. Armed with flashlights and whiskey, they made their way up the overgrown path one night in late October, laughing at the way the mist seemed to close in around them. Only 2 came back before dawn. Both were pale, trembling, and unable to speak for days. When one finally managed to talk, he said they had found the house, or what looked like the house, but it wasn't empty. He described seeing people inside, moving slowly through the rooms, their faces pale and blurred, as though viewed through water. One of the figures had turned toward him, and though he couldn't make out the features, he swore it smiled. The boy never set foot near the hill again, and within a year, he left town altogether. The others were never found. The police searched the property but claimed there was nothing there but mud and mist. Yet in the weeks that followed, dogs began howling at night, and the fog seemed to spread farther than before, creeping down into the town itself. People said it carried whispers with it, indistinct words that would rise and fade like breath. Those who dared to listen too closely said the voices didn't come from the distance at all but from the ground beneath their feet. The town fell quiet after that. No one spoke of the missing boys, and their families moved away one by one. The Callahan Hill returned to silence, but it was a silence that seemed to pulse, alive and waiting. As the years turned into decades, the story of the Callahan family became something between a myth and a warning. Parents told their children not to wander past the river, not to follow strange lights, not to listen when they heard crying in the fog. The land itself grew wild again, the trees thick and the path to the farmhouse completely swallowed by time. Yet those who had lived their whole lives near the valley said that nothing truly changed there. The fog still clung too tightly to the ground, the air still carried that faint metallic taste, and the night still held its quiet, mournful sound. Even travelers passing through could feel it, the strange stillness that settled over the hill, the sense of being watched from the edges of the mist. By the 21st century, the Callahan property had become something of a ghost hunter's legend. People from far away came with cameras and recorders, hoping to capture proof of the curse. None ever did, though a few claimed their equipment failed the moment they crossed the tree line. Some said they heard faint laughter in their recordings afterward, others caught static that almost, but not quite, sounded like voices. One group reported that the fog seemed to move around them, closing in no matter which way they turned. When they retraced their steps back down the hill, they found that hours had passed, though they swore they'd only been there minutes. They left before sunset, and when they looked back from the road below, the fog had already swallowed the hill entirely, leaving behind nothing but an empty horizon. Time went on, and the world around the valley grew brighter, louder, and busier, but that place stayed untouched, as though sealed away from everything else. The town stopped mentioning it, and even the maps forgot it again. But those who still lived nearby knew better than to believe it was gone. On rare nights, when the fog was heavy enough to blur the stars, they still saw the faint outline of a house on the hill, its windows glowing dimly through the mist. Sometimes they heard laughter, sometimes crying, sometimes both blending together into something that didn't sound quite human. And though no one dared to climb the hill anymore, they all knew that the Callahan house still stood there, waiting in the fog that never lifted, half buried but not forgotten, breathing softly beneath the soil that had claimed it long ago.